I want to run through a few things really about the wider economic landscape, particularly in the United Kingdom, and why I believe this presents a serious threat to private sector activity in general and entrepreneurialism in particular in the United Kingdom. And I have one or two ideas about how we might want to correct that. But I'm afraid this is going to be a fairly doom-laden presentation about what I consider to be the poor and worsening situation that the United Kingdom finds itself in with regards to entrepreneurialism and the private sector more generally. And throughout my presentation, I'm going to be using 3 clips from a documentary called Britain's £1 Trillion Horror Story, which was broadcast on Channel 4 last year. I do have the permission from Channel 4 to broadcast it. And if any of you would like to see, rather than just 2 or 3 edited clips in a trailer, the full bloody horror of the situation over the 90-minute documentary, then please get in touch with me, give me your business card, and I'll make sure we'll send you a copy afterwards. So I'm going to say a bit about the debt position that we face in the United Kingdom, a bit about the size of continuing government expenditure in the United Kingdom, why to some degree the actions of the coalition government don't really tackle the scale of the problem, and try and give 1 or 2 ideas about the way out and the solution. This is my favourite slide, the size of the UK's national debt, just to prove it really is an enormous black hole. But I'm actually going to ask at the back if you can play a short clip. This is just to try and get across the absolute scale of the debt in the United Kingdom and what it means in a fairly simple fashion.
4.8 trillion is a very big number. It's hard to visualize that much money, but that's where the power of television comes in. Just suppose you counted out all that national debt in £50 notes. How high would your stack of 50s be? Bear in mind that a £50 note is very thin. It's officially just 0.11 of a millimetre. That means to get a stack just 1 millimetre high, you need almost £500.
According to the government, our national debt is around £1 trillion. But that figure does not include other hidden debts, like the government's gigantic pension liabilities. The government is relying on future generations to pick up the tab for the public sector and state pensions of people working today. When these hidden liabilities are added, government debt rises to £4.8 trillion. The British government has been spending money it didn't have year after year on a truly spectacular scale. Counted out in £50 notes, our national debt would form a stack no less than 6,500 miles high. Or to put it another way, if we sold all the houses and flats in the whole of the UK, we would still be the best part of £1 trillion short of paying back our debt.
So that gives you some sense, and we always try and communicate in numbers that mean something rather than just these colossal global multi-trillion-pound figures of the actual balance sheet position of the United Kingdom at the moment. So are we actually moving to correct this diabolical problem in our public finances, or are we worsening it? Or are we simply just about capping it where it's at? Well, I like to keep my graphs extremely simple. So I've simply broken down the total government expenditure in the UK, which is about £700 billion or so, into 2 blocks. One is what you could in broad terms call welfare provision, health, education and welfare. That's the yellow section there. And its proportion of total government expenditure is about 58%. And then other, 42%, is everything else you can think of, our defence forces, arts and culture, hosting the Olympic Games, maintaining debt interest payments, local government finance and the like. So the big ticket items are health, education and welfare. If you want to tackle government spending seriously, you're going to find it very difficult to do so without doing something about that yellow block. If you want to start not adding to our debt anymore or even paying it off, it's extremely difficult to make substantial savings from that purple block, simply because there are so many tiny small things in it. So my proposition is that if we want to get government spending down, it's going to be very difficult to do so in a meaningful way without looking at what we spend on health, education, and welfare. And in the much lauded cuts being brought in by the coalition government, I think if you listen to some television stations or newspapers, you would believe there was a total holocaust in public spending was about to hit the country, that the world would never be the same again. Well, that isn't really the case. This graph shows, for the course of this Parliament, until when the next election is supposed to be in 2015, this is the amount that the government will spend on welfare, that's each year, that's the beige yellowish line, on health, the burgundy line, and on education, the purple bar. So as you can see, hardly any cuts are being made at all, and in fact, in some areas, expenditure is being increased. So these are the big ticket items for government expenditure, and that is what the Conservative Liberal coalition government's cuts look like. This still leaves us with a vast public sector. Education's set to rise. Spending in education will rise, in real terms this is, from 60.6 billion to 61.4 billion. Welfare spending, notoriously hard to predict because often depends how many people are in employment or out of employment, rises from 158.6 billion to 171 billion. And spending on the National Health Service will rise from 101.8 to 114.6 billion. Under any size, shape or form, this is a colossally large public sector that remains in these areas. In fact, areas in which most private enterprise is largely shut out, other than some contractual support really in the health sector. So I think there's also a cultural problem that needs to be tackled if we want to encourage entrepreneurialism and the private sector in the United Kingdom. And I would say there is a prevailing political view, but a view in public opinion as well, that those three large areas of government spending, education, health and welfare, can't possibly be left to the market, can't possibly be left to the private sector, can't possibly be left for entrepreneurs to find solutions and new ways of handling them, but can only be left to bureaucrats and politicians who apparently will do the most benign job they can. But I think that what Martin Durkin says here in the documentary is the sort of message that we need to get across, even in those key areas of government expenditure. So if you could play the next clip, please.
The idea that we need state monopolies in order to look after the poor is obviously untrue.
We make sure poor people in Britain have shoes and clothes and food, but we don't have state shoe shops and state clothes shops and government canteens. Can you imagine how awful that would be?
In fact, in our state health and education system, the poor do especially badly.
It's the articulate, pushy middle classes who manage to see the consultant and get their kids into the one decent state school in the area. Excuse me, you've put skimmed milk in my latte. People say you can't possibly privatise health and education because private firms will be in it to make a profit. But we're surrounded by wonderful things made by companies who need to make a profit. Do we say, we can't have a washing machine made by Bosch or Zanussi because they make a profit? Much better to have a washing machine made by the state. Let's not get a Toyota, they're in it for the money. Much wiser to wait in a queue for a government-made Trabant.
So I think what Durkin gets across there is a good general case for the market and a suggestion that we should start applying that to other areas of service provision in the United Kingdom. But that we're some way away from doing that just yet. Another area on the public finances that I just want to turn to is to demolish the idea that the problem that the United Kingdom, and indeed most other Western countries, frankly, many countries in the Eurozone and also the United States of America, that the problem we face in our public finances at the moment is somehow temporary, or the result of a specific cause, such as the global financial crisis, that there is, if we manage to clear all this up and mop it up in the next 2 years, then things can return to normal. That's sadly not true. This graph shows at 2010 sterling figures, public sector spending from 1970 and projected on to the financial year 2015-2016. And as you will see, under governments of either or any political colour, the rise in spending has been inexorable, unstoppable. There is one, I suppose you might call it, semi-heroic moment around the mid-90s, where the John Major government manages to at least freeze spending going up in real terms. But across the board, this represents almost the entirety of my lifetime, government expenditure goes up and up. And there is no, the likely outrun over the next few years isn't much different. The overall cuts will be extremely small. So this isn't a problem which has been caused by a banking crisis. It may well have been exacerbated by the banking crisis in the sense that the banking crisis caused a downturn in GDP, so tax receipts fell and so on. But this has been a general trend now for more than a generation, that public spending in real terms is increasing. So what's the United Kingdom's government response to that in terms of trying to get these numbers down? Well, if you imagine that this was the pie of overall intended government spending, that's the blue bit, then the total size of the cuts are that tiny little purple slice in the bottom of it. That's what's actually being cut out of the public sector. We will see the level of government expenditure being curbed only by 3.5% of spending. It is a tiny slice. In fairness, it is reasonable to say that because our debt interest payments increase, that some of the remaining government expenditure is just going on servicing previous debt, but nevertheless, that's the scale of it in terms of the actual reduction in spending, a pretty trivial expenditure. And to show it in real cash terms, if you believe the government's projections, that blue bar, the large blue bar, shows for each year what government expenditure will be. Most dramatic cuts in year one, but very, very quickly going up again to a level at the end of the Parliament that will be almost exactly the same as the level that we found at the start. And that tiny purple bit next to it is actually the proportion that we are spending on servicing our debt. So although that increases, it is not a substantial part of overall public expenditure. It's a relatively small part. And it's essentially a political decision to continue government spending at those fairly colossal levels, albeit with a retrenchment just this year, and then expenditure rises kicking back in. Now, one suggestion, of course, is that we could start to solve this appalling balance sheet problem by raising taxes. There's already been a banker's levy brought in. A permanent refrain of British politicians is those with the broadest shoulders should bear the largest burden. But some of the historical evidence suggests that this doesn't work. We can't just raise taxes to plug the hole. So what does this graph show? Well, this takes us back to pre-Margaret Thatcher's reign as Prime Minister. And this looks at earners. We're measuring what people's income is here, nothing else, not their capital, not the property they hold. And we're trying to see what proportion of the overall income tax take is generated by the highest 1% of earners, the next 9% of earners, and then the next 90% of earners. And that blue segment, that bluish segment, shows the contribution made by the top 1%, the highest 1% of earners. This burgundy purple section, the next 9%. So the two of them combined shows the proportion of income tax receipts generated by the richest 1 in 10. And then that yellowy section shows the contribution made by the rest. Well, this was at a time when the very top rate of income tax was an eye-watering 83%. You might assume in those circumstances that the top 1% would be contributing a very high proportion of the overall income tax receipts. And that might even look like a relatively high proportion. But actually the consequences of what happened when very swiftly this was cut to 60%, a very substantial reduction, was this. Actually, the top rate of income tax went down, and marginally, if I can flip back and forth, you can see that purple slice growing. The proportion given over by the richest 1% of the population actually increased. This is, in economic terms, a rather more progressive state of affairs, right? Overall, the richest 10% aren't contributing that much more, but the richest 1%, the highest earning, I should say, 1%, are contributing that much more. And then let's see what happens if you actually go that one step further. Highly controversial at the time, said this was all only to help the rich, cut that top rate of income tax from 60% to 40%. That's what happened. The top 1% contribute now about 23% of all income tax receipts. And the top 10% between them, that 1% plus that 9%, now contribute more than half of all income tax receipts in the United Kingdom. So as those tax rates have dropped from 83 right the way down to 40, the contribution of the affluent and the successful has actually grown as a proportion of the overall tax receipts. I think that it's not conclusive evidence, that's only a snapshot, but I think that is pretty good evidence that higher taxes are not a solution here, and not even a sensible way of bringing about what one might call fairness. Indeed, lower taxes have led to those with the broadest shoulders carrying a disproportionately high proportion of the burden. So is there another way? Well, we've seen our expenditure go up and up and up. The Heritage Foundation, alongside the IEA, the Heritage Foundation is a conservative think tank in the United States of America, alongside the Institute of Economic Affairs in London, produce every year a Freedom Index, which attempts to measure across a whole range of metrics how free a particular society is. It considers about 50% of economic data, how low are the taxes, how limited is regulation, and some political data. What's the freedom of speech position, your ability to vote and fairly stand for election, etc. And year after year, Hong Kong comes top. And this is just a short clip, again from the same documentary of Martin Durkin in Hong Kong, pointing out some of its successes compared to the United Kingdom over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. So if we could play this clip, please.
John Cowperthwaite knew that lower tax meant higher profits, that higher profits meant more growth, and that more growth meant more jobs and higher wages. Before Cowperthwaite, Hong Kongers were about a third as rich as the British. Today, GDP per capita here is a third again higher.
The odd thing is, back in 1960, say, the average Hong Konger would have probably given their right arm for the chance to live in Sunderland. Nowadays, I suspect they'd regard it as a prison sentence.
Birds singing in the sycamore tree.
A small state and low taxes did for Hong Kong exactly what they had done for Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, and news soon spread across the region. The Asian economic miracle had begun.
So Durkin refers there to Sir John Cowperthwaite, the senior civil servant in Hong Kong, who had the wisdom essentially to do nothing, to allow low taxes and low regulation. And to reiterate the point that Martin Durkin makes, you have to understand immediately after the Second World War, Hong Kong has about the wealth and about the income of, at that time, a typical African country. A very, very low level of income. It's effectively a third world country. And through simply removing regulation and reducing taxation, it is now, per capita, 50% more affluent than the United Kingdom. Quite a spectacular turnaround. And not based on any grand government plans, not based on any huge public sector projects, based on getting the government out of the way. That's what's caused the growth there. No magic to it, simply a rollback of the public sector that's produced that staggering entrepreneurial growth. Worth saying here, I'm not sure how well the colours can come up for you there, but the top line that starts at about 37% dips back down and has come back up again, ends up at the top on the end. That shows you government spending as a proportion of GDP. And the straighter line, although you can see the consequences of the recession just at the end, general progress, and then that major recession just at the end, shows you GDP in terms of millions of pounds. I just wanted to flag this up because some people suggest, again, this isn't conclusive proof against, but I think it's illustrative proof against, that the way out of the problem we're in is to spend money because have a fiscal stimulus, because that would actually encourage economic growth. If we actually spend more government money, possibly put ourselves more in debt in the short term, will stimulate the economy. As you can see there, high and increasing public spending. At no point do you see an upward curve on the government spending side that leads to an increased trajectory on the overall GDP side. If anything, there's a negative correlation. So I don't think that spending is the way out of this crisis. Hong Kong, of course, it's worth saying, this is its GDP growth since 1991. Pretty staggeringly impressive to more than nearly 3 times the size in GDP than it was in 1991. And that is the statistical comparison between Hong Kong and the UK since 1991. The UK has grown by about 50% over the last 20 years. That's along the lines of most other Western countries. The Hong Kong GDP has grown by nearly 200% in that period of time. So what are the lessons of this, and why does it matter to entrepreneurs? Well, the huge size of the public sector, in my view, doesn't just mean that whole swathes of industry are kept away from private sector entrepreneurial considerations, health and education and welfare being areas in which private involvement have been incredibly limited. But the overall public spend crowds that out. And to give you some numbers here, if we were to measure in factor cost terms, as it's called, the proportion of government spending as a proportion of the economy, what proportion of the entire economy is accounted for by government spending. Well, in Hong Kong, around about 30%, if you were to take an average of recent years. In the United Kingdom as a whole, around about 50%. And in the former Soviet Union, around about 68 to 70%. So the scale of government spending in the UK now, possibly, if anything, a little closer to the former Soviet Union than it is to the dynamic Asian tigers of Southeast Asia. And if you break down some of the different regions and areas of the United Kingdom, then in areas of the north of England, government spending is commonly above 70%. That is to say, a proportion of the economy that is greater even than the proportion that was controlled by the government in the Soviet Union. And in Northern Ireland, the proportion exceeds 80%. That is getting beyond Soviet levels and almost to North Korean levels of government expenditure. These are regions in which the private sector barely exists. And where it does exist, it's in relatively low-grade support functions for public sector workers. So you'll have lots of people working in the government and a few bars and restaurants and hairdressers to service them, but not much more. And that is now a reality in the poorer regions of the United Kingdom. So I think in order to create an environment in which we can follow the entrepreneur, we need to make sure that there are not so many hurdles on that path. We need to make sure it is a smoother and clearer path. And if we are serious about building an entrepreneurial country in the United Kingdom, then we need to take much more seriously than has been to date the scale of the public financial problem we are in, the scale of the cuts we need, and the scale of the privatisation programme that's needed to, I think, really kickstart an economy in the sort of way that we've seen in Hong Kong over the last 30 or 40 years. There isn't any other way, but I think that is the best way that we could create an entrepreneurial country here in the United Kingdom. Thanks for your time. I'm sorry to overrun.